I pulled into my parents' driveway like I had done 100 times before, the envelope with their latest utility payment sitting on the passenger seat, the same routine I had been following for years without a second thought. It had never bothered me before, never felt like an obligation, never weighed on me the way it should have, because in my mind, family was supposed to take care of each other, and I had never once questioned whether or not my sacrifices were appreciated. I had worked hard, built a career for myself, earned every penny I had without shortcuts or handouts, but I had also made sure my parents never had to worry about money, never had to stress over overdue bills, never had to wonder how they were going to make ends meet. It wasn't that they were struggling, not exactly, but they had always been bad with finances, always making impulsive decisions, always letting things slip through the cracks until suddenly there was a crisis that needed fixing. And I had always been the one to fix it. It had never even occurred to me to question whether or not I should, because I had convinced myself that this was just how things were supposed to be. I let out a slow breath as I grabbed the envelope, stepping out of my car, heading up the front steps that still creaked in the exact same spots they had when I was a kid, pushing open the door without knocking because it had never been necessary. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen, warm and familiar, and I smiled slightly as I stepped inside, calling out a greeting that was met with the usual half-hearted acknowledgement from my mother, who was seated at the kitchen table flipping through a magazine, barely glancing up as I walked in. My father, on the other hand, was sitting stiffly in his chair, his hands folded awkwardly in front of him, his expression tense in a way that immediately set me on edge. Something about the way he avoided looking at me, the way he kept shifting uncomfortably in his seat, made my stomach tighten with
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
unease, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I set the envelope down on the counter, turning toward my mother, who was still casually flipping pages, completely indifferent to the fact that I had just handed over yet another payment for bills that weren't mine. "You should really set these up for autopay," I said lightly, forcing a small chuckle, trying to push away the strange feeling creeping up my spine. It'd be easier than waiting for me to stop by every month. She hummed in response, still not looking at me, still acting like my presence was nothing more than a minor convenience, like I was a service she had gotten used to, something expected rather than appreciated. It wasn't until she spoke again that I finally understood why my father looked like he wanted to disappear. "Oh, by the way," she said, flipping another page, her voice light, almost absent-minded, like she was talking about the weather. "Emily finally has a place of her own now. Isn't that nice?" I blinked, caught off guard by the casualness of it, by the way she dropped the information like it was something minor, something unimportant, something that wouldn't completely change everything I thought I knew about where I stood in this family. "Wait, what?" I said, straightening slightly, feeling that first sharp edge of something ugly creeping into my chest. "Emily moved out? Since when?" My father shifted again, still refusing to meet my eyes, and my mother let out a small sigh, finally setting down her magazine, finally looking at me, but with the kind of expression that told me she had already decided this conversation wasn't going to be a big deal. "Not moved out exactly," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "We gave her the house. She needs it more." The words hit me like a slap, sharp and sudden, knocking the breath from my lungs in a way I hadn't been prepared for, my mind struggling to process what she had just said, trying to make sense of something that made absolutely none. "You gave her the house?" I repeated, my voice quieter now, the disbelief settling in, the reality pressing against my ribs like something suffocating. My father finally looked at me then, guilt written all over his face. But my mother? My mother just shrugged, completely unbothered, completely indifferent to the way my world had just shifted. She needed it more, she said again, as if that was all the explanation required, as if that was the end of the discussion. I stared at her, waiting for more, waiting for the justification, waiting for something that would make this make sense, but there was nothing. Just that single, apathetic shrug, that simple dismissal of everything I had done for them, that quiet confirmation that in her mind, I had never really been a factor in any of this. I thought about every check I had written, every bill I had covered, every time I had shown up without hesitation, every moment I had given up without question, and I realized I had been nothing more than a wallet to them. A steady source of support, a safety net, a fallback, but never, not once, a priority. I swallowed hard, feeling the anger settle deep, not sharp and explosive, but slow and simmering, curling around my ribs, spreading through my veins, settling into my bones. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't demand answers. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a number I had been keeping for months, a number I had never wanted to use, but had always known, deep down, that I might need one day. My mother didn't even glance up as I pressed the call button, didn't acknowledge the way I turned away, walking toward the door, my pulse steady, my breathing slow, my mind already moving 100 steps ahead. But my father watched me with wide eyes, something uncertain, something wary, something that told me he had a very bad feeling about whatever I was about to do. He wasn't wrong. Because an hour later, when my parents' phones started ringing off the hook, when Emily's screaming voicemail came through, when my mother finally called me in a panic, her voice shaking, her composure completely shattered, I knew they had finally realized the truth. They had screwed over the wrong daughter. And now? They were about to pay for it. Emily had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one who could stumble her way through life without a plan, without a backup, without ever once being held accountable for her mistakes. She was the daughter who could wreck a brand new car at 18 and have it replaced within the week, the one who could drop out of college without so much as a lecture, the one who could bounce from job to job without a care in the world because our parents were always there to pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, I had been the responsible one, the one who had to work for everything, the one who never asked for help because I had learned from an early age that help was never meant for me. I could still remember being 16 and wanting my first car, a cheap, used sedan that I had spent months saving for, taking every shift I could at the local diner, working weekends and holidays, pinching every penny just to afford something that could get me to school and work without having to rely on anyone. I had walked into the house one afternoon, proud and exhausted, ready to tell my parents that I had finally saved enough, only to find Emily sitting in the driveway in a brand new convertible, grinning ear to ear as my mother fawned over how lucky she was. When I had asked why Emily got a car without having to work for it, my mother had simply smiled and said, "She needed something reliable, sweetheart. You're a hard worker, you'll figure it out." And that was how it had always been. Emily was the one who needed things. Emily was the one who got things. And I was the one who could figure it out on my own. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my mother as she casually sipped her coffee, acting like her announcement about the house had been nothing more than a minor detail, an afterthought, something barely worth acknowledging. Across from me, my father still wouldn't look at me, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw tense, his shoulders stiff in a way that told me he already regretted being in the same room as this conversation. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, keeping my voice calm despite the slow, simmering rage building in my chest. "How did you even pay for the house?" I asked, my tone carefully even, my fingers pressing lightly against the table, grounding myself in the physical weight of the moment. "Did you take out a loan? Did you refinance? Did you use savings I didn't know you had?" My mother blinked at me like she was surprised by the question, like it had never even occurred to her that I might want to know the details, that I might actually care about how they had managed to gift an entire house to my sister while expecting me to keep covering their bills without hesitation. "It's not like you needed it," she said with a shrug, brushing off my concern like it was a pointless inconvenience, something silly, something unworthy of being acknowledged. "You have a good job, sweetheart. You don't have to worry about these things." Something inside me cracked, not all at once, not violently, but slow and deliberate, a quiet realization that settled into my bones, a cold, suffocating awareness that this wasn't just a moment of favoritism. This was proof that I had never really mattered to them the way Emily did. I had spent years pouring my time, my energy, my money into making sure they were taken care of, into making sure they never struggled, into making sure they had everything they needed. And in return, they had taken everything I had given them, pocketed it without a second thought, and turned around to hand Emily a future I had never even been considered for. I exhaled slowly, forcing down the tightness in my throat, swallowing the bitter taste of realization. "So whose name is on the deed?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more deliberate, sharper at the edges. My mother didn't answer. My father, however, stammered. And that was all I needed to hear. I walked out of my parents' house with slow, measured steps, my heartbeat steady, my breath even, my mind already shifting into problem-solving mode, the way it always did when something needed fixing. But this wasn't like all the other times I had swooped in to clean up someone else's mess, wasn't like the times I had bailed them out of late payments or helped them figure out some financial disaster they had brought upon themselves. This time, I wasn't here to save them. This time, I was here to make sure they finally felt the weight of their own decisions. The phone call I made wasn't random, wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, wasn't something I had done out of anger or impulse. I had been preparing for this moment for months, even if I hadn't known exactly what shape it would take. It had started as a suspicion, a small, nagging feeling that something wasn't right, that something had been happening behind my back, that my name was being used in ways I hadn't agreed to. I had never been careless with my finances, had always been meticulous with my accounts, had always made sure my credit was spotless, yet for the past year, something had been off. Small things, things I had brushed aside at first, a strange inquiry here, a minor discrepancy there, a loan I had supposedly pre-qualified for even though I had never applied. And now I finally knew why. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering for only a second before I pressed the call button, lifting the phone to my ear as I walked toward my car, the crisp evening air doing nothing to cool the slow-burning fire in my chest. The line rang once, then twice, before a familiar voice answered, professional but warm, the kind of voice that had always made me feel like I was in control of my own future. "Hey, it's me," I said, my voice steady, my grip tightening around my phone as I unlocked my car door but didn't get in. "I need you to check something for me, and I need it done fast." My lawyer didn't hesitate, didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't waste time. He knew me too well for that. "What am I looking for?" he asked, already pulling up whatever files he needed on his end, already setting things in motion. "My parents gave my sister a house," I said, keeping my tone light, conversational, almost amused despite the ice creeping into my veins. "But I have a feeling they didn't exactly pay for it themselves." There was a pause on the other end of the line, just a brief hesitation before I heard the familiar sound of keys clicking, of searches being run, of information being pulled faster than my parents could even begin to guess what was coming for them. It didn't take long. "You were right," he said after a few moments, his voice unreadable, carefully neutral, but with an edge of something else beneath it, something just sharp enough to tell me he wasn't happy with what he had found. "The house was never fully transferred to Emily. The deed is still technically under your parents' names, but—" He sighed, and I knew what was coming next before he even said it. "They refinanced the house using your financial history. They took out a loan against the property, and they used your credit to do it." I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the words settle, letting the final confirmation of their betrayal sink in fully. They hadn't just given Emily a house. They had stolen from me to do it. I took a slow breath, pushing back the white-hot rage threatening to bubble to the surface, forcing myself to stay calm, to stay precise, methodical, strategic. "Put a hold on everything," I said, my voice firm, my decision already made. "I don't care what it takes, don't care how much paperwork needs to be filed, freeze any further transactions, stop any pending transfers, make sure they can't touch another cent without my say-so. Consider it done," he said without hesitation, without question, without the usual lawyerly warnings about how I should think it over. He knew me better than that. I hung up and immediately dialed the bank, my mind running through every possible scenario, every possible countermove they might try to make, every excuse they would throw at me once they realized the lifeline they had been siphoning from me had just been cut. The conversation was quick, efficient, nothing more than a confirmation of what I already knew. My financial history had been accessed, My credit had been used without my knowledge, and my name had been attached to debts that I had never agreed to. But now? Now, that was over. An hour later, my phone started buzzing, first a text from my mother, short and clipped, "Call me now." Then another from my father, "We need to talk." Now. Then, finally, the inevitable screaming voicemail from Emily, her voice shrill with fury, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic mess of rage and panic. "What the hell did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. "The bank just called, and they said the mortgage is frozen. I was supposed to be finalizing everything today, and now they're saying there's a problem with the paperwork. They're saying I don't actually own the house. Fix it. Fix it right now." I listened to the message twice, then once more for good measure, letting every single word sink in, letting the satisfaction settle in my chest like a perfectly placed checkmate. Emily thought she had won. Emily thought she had been handed a free house, thought she had been gifted a future that she had done nothing to earn, thought she had gotten away with it, because why wouldn't she? After all, the golden child always won. Until, of course, the rules finally changed. I barely had time to enjoy the silence before the pounding started on my door, each heavy, frantic knock echoing through my apartment like a warning siren, a storm rolling in faster than expected. I didn't flinch, didn't move right away, just stood there for a moment, letting the sound continue, letting the desperation in each slam of her fist fuel the satisfaction growing in my chest. I had been waiting for this, had been expecting the moment Emily would come barreling into my life, demanding answers, demanding solutions, demanding that I fix the mess she and our parents had made. With a slow breath, I stepped forward, unlocking the door and swinging it open, leaning casually against the frame as I took in the sight of her, Emily, standing there with wild eyes, her face flushed red with frustration. Her lips already parted as if she had been screaming before I had even answered. Her hair was a tangled mess, her clothes wrinkled, her entire presence vibrating with barely contained fury, and for the first time in years, she looked exactly how I had always seen her, a child throwing a tantrum after finally being told no. "What the hell did you do?" she shrieked, shoving past me before I could even pretend to invite her inside, her purse swinging wildly over her shoulder as she stomped into my living room, whirling around to face me with a look of pure, unfiltered rage. "The bank is saying there's a problem with the mortgage, that the paperwork isn't valid, that there are financial holds on everything, and now the entire deal is frozen. You did this." "I know you did." I exhaled slowly, shutting the door behind me with deliberate ease, taking my time, watching as she paced back and forth in front of me, her hands gesturing wildly, her voice rising higher and higher, her panic becoming more apparent with every passing second. She was unraveling, and I wanted to watch every piece of her fall apart. I stepped forward, tilting my head slightly, keeping my voice light, almost amused, as I finally answered the question she already knew the answer to. "Emily," I said, folding my arms across my chest, meeting her burning gaze with an unwavering calm. "It was never yours to begin with." Her entire body stiffened, her nostrils flaring, her hands clenching into fists at her sides as she stared at me, the words sinking in slowly, the truth hitting her harder than she wanted to admit. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" she snapped, her voice shaking slightly now, her confidence cracking at the edges. I let the silence stretch between us, let her feel it, let her squirm under the weight of it before I finally continued, my voice smooth, precise, sharp as a knife. "It means," I said slowly, stepping closer, watching as she instinctively took half a step back, "that the house wasn't actually yours. That Mom and Dad didn't really give you anything, because they never actually had the right to. It means that every bit of paperwork, every financial decision they made, every loan they pulled was built on a foundation of fraud." Her lips parted, her eyes flickering with something doubt, disbelief, maybe even fear, before she quickly masked it with anger, shaking her head violently, refusing to process what was right in front of her. "That's not true," she spat, her voice sharp, defensive, frantic. Mom and Dad wouldn't do that. They said it was mine. They said it was taken care of. I raised an eyebrow, my lips curling into a small, knowing smile. Then why, I asked, pausing just long enough to watch the tension in her shoulders tighten, did the bank call me instead of you? Her mouth snapped shut. I watched as the realization crashed over her in real time, as her mind connected the dots, as the panic set in deeper as she understood, too late, that the house had never been hers, that she had never actually been in control. That she had been nothing more than another piece in the game our parents had been playing. The moment stretched between us, thick with the weight of it, before she finally let out a sharp breath, turning away from me, raking her fingers through her hair in frustration, muttering under her breath as she tried to come up with another excuse. Another argument, another way to make this someone else's fault. I didn't give her the chance. You can throw a tantrum all you want, I said, my voice steady, my amusement fading now, my patience wearing thin. But the facts don't change. Mom and Dad took out loans in my name. They used my financial history to secure a property they couldn't afford. And now? Now, they're the ones responsible for the consequences. Emily turned back to me, her eyes burning with something dangerous, something desperate. You don't understand what you've done, she said, her voice lower now, more controlled, more venomous. Mom and Dad are panicking. They didn't mean to screw you over, okay? They thought you wouldn't care, that you wouldn't even notice. They thought I'd just keep paying. I cut in sharply, my voice like steel, watching as she flinched, as the truth finally settled in, as she finally realized how badly they had miscalculated. Her silence was enough of an answer. I took a slow breath, stepping around her, making my way to the couch, grabbing my phone from the coffee table as it buzzed for the 5th time in the last 20 minutes. Another missed call from Mom. Another voicemail I had no interest in listening to. Emily watched me closely, her eyes narrowing as she crossed her arms, her mind still working, still trying to find a way to undo what had already been done. You need to fix this, she said finally, her voice lower now, more calculated. You need to call the bank and tell them it was a misunderstanding. You can afford it, right? You have a good job, you make good money. It's not like this is a big deal to you. I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head in disbelief at her sheer audacity. You really don't get it, do you? I murmured, scrolling through my phone, ignoring another incoming call from Dad. I don't have to fix anything. She opened her mouth to argue, but at that exact moment, my phone buzzed again, this time, not from a family member, but from my lawyer. I glanced at the screen, my lips curling into a slow, satisfied smile as I answered. Tell me, I said, my voice light, casual, easy. Just how deep in trouble are they? Emily's face drained of color. And just like that, the game was over. I had spent years watching my parents bail Emily out of every bad decision she had ever made, had witnessed them bend over backward to fix problems she had caused, had listened to excuse after excuse about why she deserved another chance. Another opportunity, another handout. But this time, there was no safety net waiting to catch her, no last-minute rescue from the people who had always shielded her from reality, because this time, the consequences were real, and there was nothing they could do to stop what was coming. The call from my lawyer had confirmed everything I had suspected, every single misstep my parents had taken, every legal line they had crossed, every financial decision they had made without considering what would happen if I ever found out. The fraudulent refinancing, the loans secured in my name, the property title transfers that had been pushed through without my consent, it had all finally caught up to them, and the fallout was going to be worse than they could have possibly imagined. The bank had wasted no time in reversing the fraudulent mortgage, freezing any pending transactions, and issuing a demand for full repayment. The moment my lawyer filed the necessary paperwork, every cent they had pulled from my financial history was immediately revoked, leaving my parents drowning in a mountain of debt they had no way of paying off. And Emily? Emily lost the house overnight. She had spent the last 24 hours calling me nonstop, alternating between furious, tear-filled voicemails and barely coherent text messages, desperately trying to convince me that I had overreacted, that I had blown things out of proportion. that I had ruined her life for no reason. But the truth was, her life had never been hers to begin with. It had been built entirely on stolen money, stolen resources, stolen opportunities that were never meant for her. I had ignored every single message, every single call, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a response, knowing that nothing I said would change the reality she was now forced to face. But my parents? They weren't willing to let me ignore them. The knocking on my front door started just after noon, sharp and urgent, the kind of knock that carried desperation, the kind that told me they had run out of options. I took my time answering, letting them wait, letting them stew in their panic, letting the weight of what they had done settle deep in their bones before I finally pulled the door open, keeping my face carefully blank as I took them in. My father looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, his hands twisting together as if he could wring a solution out of thin air. My mother was a mess, her eyes red and swollen, her mouth set in a tight, anxious line, her usual air of superiority completely gone, replaced with something that almost looked like genuine fear. "Sarah," she breathed, her voice breaking slightly, her fingers twitching at her sides like she wanted to reach for me, like she thought this was still fixable. "Sweetheart, please, we need to talk." I exhaled slowly, tilting my head slightly, pretending to consider her words before stepping aside, gesturing for them to come in, knowing full well they thought this conversation was going to end in their favor. They stepped inside hesitantly, as if they weren't sure they were welcome anymore, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely in control. They sat on the couch, my mother wringing her hands, my father clearing his throat uncomfortably, both of them looking at me like I was some kind of stranger, like they had never truly known me at all. "We made a mistake," my father said finally, his voice low, careful, as if admitting guilt would somehow make me feel sorry for them. "We never meant for things to go this far. We thought it wouldn't be a big deal, that you'd understand, that I'd just keep paying." I interrupted, my voice flat, sharp, devoid of the patience I had once wasted on them. My mother let out a shaky breath, nodding quickly, her lips pressing together like she was trying to keep herself from breaking down completely. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But, Sarah, you have to understand, we were just trying to help Emily. She needed a fresh start. She needed security. She needed what?" I cut in, my voice colder now, my gaze locked onto hers. "She needed something she didn't earn? She needed something she couldn't afford? She needed a house that you stole from me to give to her?" My mother flinched at the word stole, but she didn't deny it. "Please," she whispered, leaning forward slightly, her hands reaching toward me, like she thought begging would undo everything. "We can fix this, sweetheart. We can figure something out. Just talk to the bank. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding, help us fix this, and we'll make it up to you. We promise." I let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking my head, wondering if they truly believed there was still a version of this where I would save them. "You don't get it, do you?" I murmured, my lips curling into a slow, knowing smile as I reached for my phone, scrolling through my recent emails, pulling up the final confirmation I had been waiting for. "There's nothing left to fix." I turned the screen toward them, watching as their eyes darted over the words, as their expressions shifted from desperation to sheer horror. Because the truth was simple. The house was gone. The debt was theirs to deal with. And I had bought the house from the bank. My mother let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth, her body shaking with the force of her realization. My father's breath hitched, his face draining of color, his fingers gripping his knees so tightly that his knuckles turned white. You didn't," my mother choked out, her voice barely audible. I smiled, slow and deliberate, leaning back in my chair, watching them with a satisfaction I had never known before. "I did," I confirmed, keeping my voice light, keeping my expression calm, relishing every second of their unraveling. Emily had lost the house. My parents had lost everything. And I had won. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, the kind that made every breath feel heavier, the kind that pressed down on my parents like the weight of their own terrible choices. My mother sat frozen on the couch, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of her sweater, her eyes darting between me and the phone screen that displayed the one truth she had never expected to face. My father had leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, his entire body radiating the exhaustion of a man who had just realized he had played a losing game from the very start. And then there was Emily, standing stiffly near the doorway, her expression unreadable, her fingers clenched into fists, her entire body vibrating with barely contained rage. Disbelief clouding her eyes as she stared at me like she still couldn't quite understand what had happened. "You bought it?" She finally whispered, her voice hoarse, raw, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Disbelief, betrayal, maybe even fear. "You actually bought the house?" I tilted my head slightly, watching her carefully, letting her process the words that I knew would haunt her for a long, long time. "I did," I said simply, my voice calm, steady, unwavering in its finality. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her breath coming in sharp little bursts, her entire body stiffening like she was bracing herself for some kind of impact. She looked to my mother for support, for comfort, for some sort of explanation that would make sense of this, but there was nothing there, just wide, stunned eyes and shaking hands, just the slow, creeping realization that everything they had taken from me was now back in my hands. Emily let out a short, bitter laugh, but there was no amusement in it, just pure frustration, pure disbelief, pure, unfiltered anger. "You stole it from me," she hissed, her voice sharp and accusing, like she truly believed she had been wronged, like she truly believed she had been cheated out of something she had never actually earned. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment linger before I finally leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, locking my gaze onto hers with an unwavering steadiness that I knew she couldn't match. "I didn't steal anything," I said smoothly, watching as her jaw clenched, as her hands curled even tighter into fists. "The house was never yours to begin with. You just thought it was because Mom and Dad let you believe they could give you something that was never actually theirs to give." Emily's breath hitched, her lips parting slightly, her eyes flickering with doubt, with the first flickers of realization, with the truth settling deep in her bones. "But don't worry," I continued, letting my voice take on a light, almost teasing edge, knowing full well it would infuriate her. "You can stay if you pay rent." Emily went completely still, her entire body locking up, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to pure, unchecked rage. "You're joking," she snapped, her voice rising, her breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. "You think I'm going to pay rent to you? You think I'm just going to hand you money every month like some kind of tenant in my own house?" I smiled, slow and deliberate, knowing that nothing would shatter her pride more than hearing what I was about to say next. "It's not your house," I reminded her gently, tilting my head slightly, watching as she flinched at the words, as they settled into her skin like a brand. "But you're welcome to live there, if you can afford it." My mother let out a choked sob, her head dropping into her hands, her shoulders shaking with the weight of the realization that everything they had worked so hard to take from me was now gone, lost forever, completely out of their control. My father had gone completely silent, his face pale, his fingers still gripping his knees like he was holding onto the last remnants of his own shattered pride. "Please, Sarah," my mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hands trembling as she reached toward me, as if physical contact could somehow fix what had already been broken beyond repair. "We didn't mean for it to happen like this. We didn't mean to hurt you. We just thought, you thought I wouldn't fight back." I cut in sharply, my voice like steel, watching as she flinched, as she closed her eyes, as she let out a shaky breath that did absolutely nothing to gain my sympathy. "You thought I would just keep paying for everything, keep being the responsible one, keep making sure you never had to face the consequences of your own terrible decisions. But you were wrong." Emily let out another bitter laugh, but this time, it was shaky, uneven, borderline hysterical. "You think this makes you better than us?" She spat, shaking her head, her breath hitching as she glared at me like she wanted to tear me apart with her bare hands. "You think this makes you the good guy?" I arched an eyebrow, tilting my head slightly, considering her words before finally offering her a slow, satisfied smile. "No," I said simply, watching as her expression flickered with confusion, with frustration, with barely concealed rage. "But it makes me the one who won." Emily's face twisted with fury, her hands shaking at her sides, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as she stared at me, as she tried to find something, anything, that would hurt me the way I had just shattered her entire world. But there was nothing left to say. She stormed past me, her footsteps heavy, her entire body radiating rage, her pride too wounded to let her stay in the same room as me for a second longer. The door slammed behind her, the sound ringing through the silence like the final nail in a coffin. I turned back to my parents, watching as my mother let out another broken sob, as my father finally buried his face in his hands, as the weight of their loss settled fully onto their shoulders. "You don't have to do this," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking, desperate. I inhaled slowly, taking in the sight of them one last time, memorizing the look on my mother's face, the regret in her eyes, the exhaustion in my father's slumped shoulders, the absolute and complete ruin of the people who had thought they could use me forever. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, I stood up, smoothing out my jacket, glancing toward the door where Emily had disappeared, letting my lips curve into a small, satisfied smirk. "You were right, Mom," I murmured, my voice soft, final, devastating. "She does need it more." And with that, I walked away, leaving them to drown in the wreckage they had built with their own hands.